there are moments in London when the fog itself seems to breathe, when the city's pulse slows and every lamplit window conceals a secret too heavy for daylight. It was in such an hour, with the gaslights burning dim and the river whispering beneath its veil of mist, that fate carried to our rooms in Baker Street a matter upon which the peace of Europe hung by a thread. Not a murder, nor a theft in the vulgar sense, but a disappearance, swift, bloodless, and inexplicable. A foreign envoy had vanished between breakfast and the signing of a treaty. No trace, no cry, no ransom, only a single white carnation, pressed and perfumed, left upon his table like a ghost's signature. What began as a puzzle of diplomacy soon darkened into a chase through the fog-bound arteries of London, among cab-yards and perfumers, river stairs and funeral coaches, where every sound seemed to conspire and every shadow might hold a spy. In that labyrinth of deceit, Holmes would once again prove that reason, even when cornered by intrigue and betrayal, remains the one torch that never fails in the dark. This, then, is the case I have titled Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Vanished Envoy. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. A fog, a letter, and a carnation. The November fog lay in tiers beyond our windows, like the folds of a dingy curtain, each stratum distinct in its opacity, as though London herself had drawn about her shoulders the very garments of oblivion. I stood at the glass, watching the street lamps emerge and fade like drowned moons, while behind me, Holmes, long stretched upon the settee, with that peculiar listlessness which sometimes possessed him between cases, had been discoursing upon the comparative value of the ashes left by Balkan cigarettes. An old Persian slipper lay at his elbow, its embroidered toe pointing accusingly toward the coal scuttle, which he had drawn near his lean hand with the careful economy of a man who wishes not to rise. "The Serb blend," he was saying, his voice taking on that lecturer's cadence which I had come to recognize as the prelude to some arcane monograph, "leaves a distinctive grey powder with flecks of crimson when examined under sufficient magnification. The Bulgarian, by contrast, yields a uniform ash of remarkable tenacity. It will hold its shape even when transported in the waistcoat pocket, a fact which proved instructive in the Markoff affair. But the Romanian, Watson, the Romanian is the aristocrat of the tobacco world. Its ash crumbles at the merest breath, yet leaves upon the fingers a resinous trace which no amount of washing will immediately. A tap, light, precise, official, fell upon the door. The sound possessed a quality which caused Holmes to cease mid-sentence and swing his long legs from the settee with that sudden galvanic energy which marked his transition from languor to acute attention. His grey eyes, which had been half-lidded with the torpor of disuse, now blazed with that peculiar light I had learned to associate with the prospect of mental exertion. "The Foreign Office," he murmured, brushing ash from his dressing-gown. "Note the interval between knocks, precisely measured, neither hurried nor leisurely. A man schooled in the etiquette of official corridors, Watson, where to knock too boldly suggests presumption, and to knock too softly implies uncertainty. We shall have our case, I think." Mrs. Hudson ushered in a pale, compact gentleman whose frock-coat sat upon him, as a uniform sits upon a soldier, not merely worn, but inhabited. He bore himself with that curious combination of deference and authority peculiar to those who serve great offices without being great men themselves. In his hand he carried, not a card case as I had expected, but a sealed envelope of blue paper, which he held as though it contained something both precious and dangerous. With a bow to Holmes and a nod to myself, he stated that he was Mr. Percy Tolliver of the Foreign Office. "We resort to you, Mr. Holmes," said he, and there was in his voice a note which suggested that the words had been carefully chosen, perhaps even rehearsed during his cab ride through the fog, "because there is no hour left to us in which to pretend that we can do without you." Holmes's eyes brightened with unmistakable pleasure. "Your words are a passport, Mr. Tolliver," said he, gesturing to our basket chair. "Pray be seated. I observe, by the dusting of your left cuff with white powder, that you have been to Downing Street this very morning. Their clerks copy upon the old lithographic stone still, a practice abandoned elsewhere, but retained there from a mixture of economy and sentiment. You have come here without your hat, lost in a cab? No, set down in haste upon the hall table of some superior who summoned you with insufficient warning to permit the niceties of dress. The errand must be grave indeed when a man of your evident precision arrives at a consulting room without his headgear." Tolliver had gone rather pale. "You are correct in every particular, Mr. Holmes. The permanent under-secretary sent for me at 9:15, and I—" He paused, seeming to gather himself. "But I see that I shall waste your time with preliminaries. The matter is this." He placed the envelope upon our table with the care of a man handling explosives. It was addressed to Holmes by name in a bold, flowing script, and marked in the upper right corner with the single word "immediate," underscored twice. Holmes slit it open with his paper knife. An ivory affair which had come to him, I believe, from some grateful Maharaja, and drew forth a single sheet of thick notepaper, and, curiously, a pressed white carnation. The flower lay upon the table like a small ghost, its petals perfect despite their compression. Holmes lifted it to his nostrils with that delicate precision which characterized all his movements when examining evidence, while I leaned forward to read the message over his shoulder. The writing, strong, feminine, continental in its flourishes, ran as follows: "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if England wishes to save both a man and a paper, you must be at the Hotel Metropole before noon. Bring not the police. Trust the Carnation. V." "The Hotel Metropole," said Tolliver, and now his voice had dropped to that tone of carefully controlled urgency which speaks more loudly than any shout. "Harbours at this moment the envoy extraordinary of the Principality of Pohu, one Nicola Varadin. He arrived yesternight upon the boat train, and was to sign, this very day, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a protocol which, if lost or if unsigned, would throw 3 powers into a posture of arms. At 11 o'clock this morning he was to attend upon us at the Foreign Office for a preliminary conference. He has not come. More than that, he is gone." "Gone?" Holmes's voice was sharp. "Vanished from his rooms after breakfast, his valet in attendance when last seen, his red portfolio, which contains the only unsigned copy of the protocol, nowhere to be found, and a hansom reported by the porter to have been taken up at the side entrance at approximately 10:30. His private secretary, a Mr. Cyril Markham, an Englishman in his service, is distraught. The police have been warned discreetly. But your name alone, Mr. Holmes, has been upon the lips of those who understand the delicacy of the situation. We cannot have Scotland Yard tramping through a diplomatic suite, questioning envoys and secretaries, when the merest whisper of scandal could undo months of negotiation. Holmes had been examining the Carnation with minute attention, holding it close to his eyes, then at arm's length, then rotating it slowly between his long fingers. "Attar. No, not rose," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "There is a whisper of orris, and the stem has been cut with a very sharp blade, probably within the last 12 hours. The paper bears a shade of purple where the ink has sunk. A foreign copying ink, not the India ink used by English stationers. IV. Watson, do the letters suggest aught to you?" I considered. The initials might be those of the envoy himself, though that seems improbable, given the feminine hand. Or perhaps a reversal. V.I. Victoria Imperatrix. "You reach for the crown when a flower would suffice," said Holmes with a faint smile. "No, Watson. Observe the hand itself. Note the continental K in Sherlock, the open loop of the S, the slight leftward slant which suggests a writer educated in the German style, but possessed of Latin temperament. This is a woman, certainly, and one accustomed to writing in haste, but not without elegance. More than that, she is of a house where orris is kept in quantity, or where her glove was powdered from a dressing-table. Orris root is expensive, Watson, and used only by those who can afford to scent not merely their persons, but their very garments." He sprang up with that suddenness which had so often startled me in moments of decision. "The fog thickens, and the hour wanes. We have," he consulted his watch, 1 hour and 40 minutes before noon. "Watson, your hat and stick. Mr. Tolliver, you will accompany us. We shall begin at once where the trail is freshest, in the rooms which have just been emptied, before the hotel staff obliterate, in their well-meaning efficiency, those small traces which speak volumes to the trained observer." As we descended to the street, I glanced back at our sitting-room. The letter lay upon the table, where Holmes had left it. The Carnation, pale as winter moonlight, remained near his untasted breakfast cup. In that simple flower, crushed and preserved between sheets of foreign paper, I had yet to learn how much lay hidden of warning, of danger, and of redemption. The fog closed around us as we stepped into the hansom. Holmes sat with his chin upon his breast, his eyes half closed, already constructing in that extraordinary mind of his the architecture of the case from the few materials we possessed. Beside me, Tolliver clutched his dispatch case with white knuckles, and I knew that behind the calm facade of Whitehall, men were watching the clock with mounting dread. Chapter 2. The Metropole and the Blotted Word. The Hotel Metropole rose from the fog like some great ocean liner beached upon the Strand, its facade a monument to that peculiar architectural philosophy which holds that no surface should remain unadorned if gilt, marble, or plaster work might be applied. We swept through the revolving doors into a lobby of such aggressively opulent vulgarity that I found myself instinctively lowering my voice, as though the very carpets might take offence at ordinary speech. The suite occupied by the envoy extraordinary was upon the 3rd floor, reached by an elevator operated by a boy whose brass buttons gleamed with such ferocity that I suspected they were polished hourly. Holmes questioned him with that deceptive casualness which concealed the razor edge of his attention. "You were on duty this morning, my lad?" "Yes, sir. Since 8 o'clock, sir." And the gentleman from room 347. Did you carry him down?" The boy's face clouded with thought. "No, sir. Leastways, not the foreign gentleman. His man, the valet, sir, came down twice. Once at 9 with some boots for cleaning, and again at 10:30, looking right agitated, asking had anyone seen his master. But the master himself? Never saw him, sir. But then—" The boy hesitated. "Yes?" Holmes's voice was encouraging, almost paternal. "The side stairs, sir. They're not used except by them what wants to avoid the lobby. A lady in mourning went up that way this morning, about 10:15. I saw her from the corridor, black veil and all. But whether she went to 347, I couldn't say." Holmes pressed a coin into the boy's palm. "You have the eyes of a detective, young man. Should you ever tire of brass buttons, there is a profession which values observation above ornament." The suite itself was all that hotel managers mistake for the comfort desired by persons of consequence. Heavy draperies of crimson plush, furniture upholstered in patterns which assaulted the eye, and everywhere the gleam of surfaces polished to a hostile sheen. Yet beneath this commercial grandeur I sensed immediately the presence of something amiss, a disorder that had nothing to do with the natural untidiness of occupation. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood by the marble mantelpiece with an air of permission rather than authority, his terrier-like features arranged in that expression of watchful competence which I had observed in him many times before. Beside him, pacing with the nervous energy of a caged bird, was a fair young man whose delicate hands and artistic bearing marked him as incongruous in that vulgar room. Mr. Cyril Markham, I presumed. In the corner, partially obscured by an elephantine armchair, stood a small leather trunk bearing upon its battered lid the faded arms of the Principality of Ornaing, visible even through the scuffs and stains of much travel. "I make you known to Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," said Tolliver, with the relief of a man transferring a burden. Lestrade inclined his head with a look I had seen many times before, a mixture of genuine relief and that faint competitive jealousy which even the best of Scotland Yard's men could not entirely suppress when Holmes appeared upon a scene. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, coming forward with hand extended, "I've kept everything as it was found, sir. The envoy's man discovered the rooms empty at 10:40. No signs of violence, no disorder beyond what you see, which is to say, the ordinary confusion of a gentleman's morning toilet. The bed has been slept in, breakfast taken. A tray was brought up at 8 and removed at 9, mostly consumed. After that, nothing." Holmes made no immediate reply. Instead, he commenced that rapid yet methodical circuit of the chamber which I had witnessed so many times that I could have predicted each movement. The examination of the window-sills for marks, the inspection of the carpet for footprints, the careful scrutiny of the fireplace grate. He moved with that peculiar bird-like quality which suggested some creature designed by nature specifically for the pursuit of detail, his long nose leading him from clue to clue as surely as a hound follows a scent. He lifted the envoy's chair from beside the escritoire, examining its underside with his pocket lens, then peered at the coal ash in the grate, prodding it gently with the poker. Finally, he straightened and stood over the blotting pad which lay upon the writing desk, its surface covered with those meaningless abstract patterns which are the fossil record of correspondence. "Your master smoked, Mr. Markham?" Holmes asked, his gaze still fixed upon the blotter. The young secretary, who had been standing in an attitude of barely suppressed agitation, started at being addressed. Yes, Mr. Holmes. Balkan cigarettes, maize paper. But he forbore this morning. He complained of neuralgia, and said the damp London air was oppressive to his temples. Indeed, Holmes tapped the blotter with one long finger, and wrote, upon poor hotel paper, the kind provided gratis by establishments which charge guineas per night. The hand is not his, however. Yours, perhaps. I wrote a note to Mr. Tolliver early this morning, said Markham, his pale face colouring slightly. The envoy was to come to the Foreign Office at 11 o'clock for the preliminary conference. I confirmed the appointment. Precisely. Holmes tilted the blotting pad toward the window, where the grey light fell upon it with that peculiar quality which makes fog-filtered illumination so merciless. Watson, the glass, if you please. I handed him my pocket lens, the same instrument which had served us in so many investigations, that its brass rim bore the patina of 1,000 examinations. With infinite care, Holmes brought the surface of the blotter into focus, his eyes narrowing as he traced the ghostly indentations left by recent writing. You see, Watson, the reverse impression, read in mirror. Here, stairs, and before it, what appears to be 9. Below, partially obscured, pole, and then stairs again. And here, at the bottom, smudged but discernible, bring. Yes, definitely bring. The last word is unfortunately obliterated, but we have sufficient. Pole stairs, I hazarded. A proper name? Pole stairs, murmured Holmes, setting down the lens. Pollards, Pollux, or, by heaven, Pollux Stairs. His voice took on that note of satisfaction which indicated a connection made. A river landing, Watson, and an hour. 9 o'clock. We are invited to an appointment which was not meant for us. River thieves, cried Lestrade, his professional instincts immediately suggesting the practical interpretation. We've had a plague of them from Blackwall clear to Bermondsey this autumn. Bold as brass, some of them, luring gentlemen to the docks with tales of smuggled goods at bargain prices, then coshing them and leaving them for the tide. Perhaps, said Holmes, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. But mark, Inspector, the odours of the room. What do you smell? Lestrade sniffed dutifully. Coal smoke, lavender from the linen, and a medicinal something. Carbolic, I'd say. Carbolic, exactly. Faint, yet present. Not the heavy carbolic reek of a surgeon's theatre or a hospital ward, rather the lighter trace of a man who handles it daily in small quantities, perhaps for cleansing purposes. Mr. Markham, approach, if you would be so kind. The secretary came forward with evident reluctance. Holmes reached out, and with a gentleness that was none the less inexorable, took the young man's right hand. You are a secretary, sir, yet your forefinger bears a cracked polish at the nail and a slight brown stain upon the cuticle. Here, just at the edge. I have seen the same upon clerks who copy with purple aniline ink, which has a distressing tendency to penetrate even the most careful hand. But the carbolic tells me you cleansed something this morning. A penknife, perhaps, after cutting something gummy or adhesive. A curious combination of activities for a diplomatic secretary. Markham withdrew his hand as though it had been burned. I trimmed a thread from the envoy's cuff. It was a small service, nothing more. His man had been careless in some previous mending. An odd attention from a secretary, observed Holmes, but let us pursue the matter. The cuff itself is gone, conveyed away with His Excellency. But Here upon the carpet is the thread you cut, caught in the pile near the escritoire. He knelt, that extraordinary man who could condescend to examine a carpet with the same intensity he might bring to a rare manuscript, and plucked something from between the fibres with his tweezers. Rising, he held it to the light, a short length of green thread, and adhering to it, unmistakably, a tiny particle of paint. "Green paint," Holmes announced. "Arsenical green, unless I am much mistaken. That particularly vivid shade which was fashionable 20 years ago for carriages, and which is now seen only upon vehicles whose owners have not modernized their livery. Inspector Lestrade, you have a more intimate knowledge of London's wheels than I. Have you seen a cab painted this particular shade?" Lestrade's face brightened with professional pride. "That I have, Mr. Holmes. It's the funeral company's livery at Kennington, Hargreaves and Son. They keep 4 cabs for the use of mourners, all painted that colour. Old Mr. Hargreaves is particular about his tradition. Says his father chose the colour in '63, and he'll not change it for fashion." "Funeral wheels beside a river stairs," Holmes murmured, his eyes growing distant with that inward look which indicated rapid mental calculation. "A promising conjunction, Inspector. We begin to see the shape of the instrument, though we have not yet heard its music." He turned to the trunk with the faded arms, which had sat forgotten in its corner throughout this examination. "This was the envoy's luggage?" "Only his smaller trunk, Mr. Holmes," said Markham. "He travels with 3 pieces, a large trunk for his wardrobe, this smaller one for personal items, and the red portfolio which was always in his hand or upon his person. That portfolio contained the protocol." Holmes lifted the lid, and we crowded round to peer within. The contents spoke of a man who travelled frequently, but lived simply. Several shirts of good linen, but much worn. A small stack of handkerchiefs bearing a monogram in Cyrillic letters. A worn book in what I took to be the Slavic tongue. A cake of yellowish wax, such as might be used for sealing letters, and, curious among these prosaic items, a crumpled visiting card. Holmes lifted this last with his tweezers and held it flat upon his palm. It was of good stock, but showed signs of having been much handled. Upon its face was printed in black ink a single playing card suit. The club. Beneath this, written in a different hand and in ordinary pen ink, was the number 7. "Your master was a clubman?" asked Holmes, his eyes fixed upon Markham's face with that unwavering intensity which I had seen wring confessions from stronger men than this pale secretary. "It is rather," said Markham, and I detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. "The sign of a certain coterie among our countrymen in London. The 7 Club, if you like. A private signal, no more. A way for compatriots to recognize one another in a foreign city." "Private signals placed upon hotel tables," observed Holmes, drawing from his breast pocket the white carnation which had accompanied our mysterious letter. "And, it would appear, upon my own breakfast table. An orris-scented glove, a 7 of clubs, a green funeral wheel, and a river stairs at 9 o'clock. We make progress, Mr. Tolliver, though the tune is as yet discordant." He crossed to the window and threw up the sash with a sudden movement. The fog pressed in immediately, bringing with it the rumble and hiss of the city, the cry of vendors, the clop of hooves, the perpetual undertone of 10,000 lives pursuing their separate purposes. But Holmes's attention was fixed upon the window frame itself. "You see, Watson, here, upon the sash, A scrap of something has lodged itself, caught by static or a splinter. He pinched it delicately between thumb and forefinger and brought it into the light. "It appears to be a hair," I ventured. "Not hair at all," said Holmes, examining it through his lens. "Catgut, a violin E-string filament, teased to thread and broken off. Someone has recently been in this room who plays, or has been in close contact with one who plays, and moreover, who has been to a place where violin strings are purchased or mended. London has few such places where orris-scented gloves and violin strings might mingle in the same establishment. I know one in particular, however, 2 doors apart in Jermyn Street. Floris's for the scent, and the little shop of Mr. Barani for strings to every instrument in Europe." He snapped the sash shut with a decisive gesture that made us all start. "We will pay our respects to both, Watson. Inspector Lestrade, I must ask you to send a man to Pollux Stairs, discreetly, mind you, and in plain clothes. Let him arrive before 9 o'clock this evening, and observe who comes and goes, but on no account is he to interfere or make his presence obvious. Too many feet will break the crust upon this little pudding, and we wish to see what rises when it is properly baked." Holmes's eye ranged once more over the chamber with that sweeping, comprehensive gaze which I had come to recognize as his method of fixing a scene permanently in memory. That extraordinary mental filing system which allowed him to recall years later the precise position of objects in rooms he had visited but once. He picked up the envoy's book, opened it at random, frowned at the incomprehensible text, and laid it down again. "Mr. Tolliver," he said, turning to our Foreign Office friend with grave courtesy, "pray restrain all tongues at Whitehall. The merest whisper of this disappearance, and we shall have every scandal sheet in London manufacturing theories, while the true solution slips away down the river. Mr. Markham, you will not leave the Metropole. Take your meals here, remain visible to the staff, and if anyone asks for the envoy, say that he is indisposed with neuralgia. It is a maxim of mine that a secretariat is the shortest road between a treaty and a scandal, and I would prefer that this particular road remain untravelled." With a final gesture, so careless to the untrained eye, yet so deliberate to one who knew him, he slipped the white carnation into his buttonhole. In that gesture there was an acceptance of a signal, a declaration that he had taken up the challenge laid before him, and a setting of our faces toward those dark streets where the fog rose like breath from some sleeping beast that might at any moment awaken to devour us all. Chapter 3. The Lady of the Vale and the River Fog. Jermyn Street, in the heart of St. James's, wears its respectability like a well-cut coat, expensive, understated, and faintly intimidating to those unaccustomed to its particular species of refinement. We found Floris's establishment crowded with gentlemen of leisure and means, each engaged in that peculiarly masculine ritual of affecting not to care deeply about matters of scent while subjecting themselves to elaborate consultations regarding eau de cologne, lavender water, and pomades. Holmes, with a nicety of social manner that I sometimes forgot he possessed, exchanged no more than a word with the silver-haired manager and emerged within 5 minutes, having conducted his inquiry with such discretion that none of the other patrons even glanced in our direction. As we stepped back into the fog, I detected upon his cuff the faintest tremor of orris. "A lady," he said quietly as we walked, "purchased yesterday evening a small bottle of orris water and charged it to an account kept by a Madame Solvay, residing in Kensington. The account is 12 years old, regularly paid, and used infrequently. The lady who made yesterday's purchase is not, however, Madame Solvay. She is younger, dark-haired, and possesses what the manager described as continental features. She wore gloves and carried a small package wrapped in paper from a music shop. Did he recall anything else? Only that she seemed agitated and glanced frequently at the street, as though expecting pursuit or meeting. Holmes's lips curved in that slight smile which indicated satisfaction. Barani is next, Watson. Let us discover what melody this violin-maker can play for us. The shop of Mr. Barani stood, indeed, but 2 doors from Floris's, set back slightly from the street in one of those architectural alcoves which seem designed to shelter enterprises of a specialized and slightly mysterious nature. The window displayed no more than a dusty fiddle propped against a sunken vial, both instruments appearing so aged and neglected that they might have been archaeological relics rather than items for sale. Yet the moment we pushed open the door, I was struck by a transformation. Within, the shop was a treasury of musical craft, with instruments hanging from every wall and ceiling beam, and the air thick with the mingled scents of rosa, varnish, and old wood. A dark-eyed man emerged from the rear of the shop, wiping his hands upon a cloth stained with the colours of his trade. He bowed to us with that peculiar gravity which seems itself an instrument, a dignity born not of pride, but of dedication to an art. "You had, yesterday evening," Holmes began without preface, his voice taking on that slight edge which indicated he would tolerate no evasion. "A lady who purchases E-strings and powders her gloves with orris. She carried a white carnation and spoke with the accent of the Danube." Barani's eyelids flickered, the merest tremor, but sufficient for Holmes's hawk-like attention. "I sell to many accents, sir," he replied carefully. "To this one," said Holmes, taking a step closer. "You sold also a small phial of rosin, and you took from her a card which you posted upon your shelf." His gaze darted to a narrow ledge behind the counter, where among a scatter of receipts, invoices, and curled strings of packing twine, there indeed lay a playing card, the 7 of clubs, precisely as we had seen in the envoy's trunk. Barani followed Holmes's gaze and permitted himself a small, knowing smile. "When a lady asks that a gentleman of science may be led to her without the police," he said slowly, "one obeys, if one loves music more than money. The police are tone-deaf, Mr. Holmes. They hear only discord. But you have the ears for a proper fugue." "Where is she to be seen?" "At St. Jude's Court, in a room above the photographer's establishment. Number 4, 2nd floor. That is all I know, and all I was asked to convey should you come seeking. The card I kept as insurance, perhaps. One never knows in these times when a small proof of one's honesty might be required." Holmes nodded slowly, and I saw that gleam of respect which he reserved for those rare individuals who displayed both principle and pragmatism. "Nor am I. Today," Holmes returned. "You have my thanks, sir, and my assurance that if this matter touches upon your reputation, I shall see that only credit accrues to it." As we emerged once more into the fog-choked street, Holmes consulted his watch. 11:45. We have time, just barely. St. Jude's Court is a pleasant quarter-hour's walk, or 5 minutes by cab if we can secure one. Come, Watson, let us discover what message our mysterious correspondent has for us. St. Jude's Court proved to be one of those forgotten veins of old London, a narrow sliver running off the Strand, terminating in a cul-de-sac where gaslight struggled even at midday with the encroaching murk. The buildings rose on either side with that particular Victorian ugliness which mistakes blackened brick and iron railings for architectural gravitas. We mounted a staircase that creaked with damp and age past a photographer's studio whose glass sign bore the legend "Portraits and Mourning Pictures, reasonable rates," until we reached a second-floor landing where two doors faced each other like antagonists across a narrow battlefield of warped floorboards. Holmes tapped at the right-hand door with the ivory head of his stick. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo down into the bowels of the building. For a long moment there was no response, and I became aware of the sounds of the court. Somewhere below, a woman's voice raised in irritation, the distant rumble of a cart over cobbles, the hiss and sputter of the gaslight on the landing. Then the door opened the width of a gloved hand, and a pair of eyes of extraordinary resolution surveyed us through a black veil. They were dark eyes, but with a peculiar luminosity that suggested either great intelligence or great fear. Perhaps both. "You have the flower," said a low, musical voice with the faintest trace of that continental accent Holmes had predicted. "Then you are the man." "Sherlock Holmes, at your service, madam," said my companion, with a bow that would not have been out of place in a drawing-room. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. John Watson, whose discretion is absolute and whose courage has been tested in circumstances far more dangerous than this, I assure you." She admitted us with swift caution, her eyes darting to the staircase, as though she expected pursuit even here. The room itself was plain to the point of austerity. A travelling case sat upon a narrow bed. A violin in its shabby case lay across the room's single chair, and the air held that faint sharpness which I had encountered before in dark rooms, the sour, sweet tang of photographic chemicals seeping through the walls from the studio next door. "I am Ilona Varady," she said, lifting her veil with a gesture that suggested both relief and resignation. Her face, though pale from want of sleep, or perhaps from some deeper exhaustion of the spirit, possessed a lively dignity that transcended her evident distress. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with features that bore the stamp of good breeding and intelligence. "I am cousin to Nicola Varadin, the man whom you seek. He came to London under what we might call a death sentence. Not official, you understand, but whispered in our cafes, muttered in our political clubs, and understood by all who have eyes to see. The treaty he bears would sweep the hands from certain men's watches, would rearrange the very map of Europe. There are those who have sworn that either the paper or the man shall not pass." Holmes had been studying her with that peculiar intensity which made even innocent persons uncomfortable, but his voice, when he spoke, was gentle. "And yet, madam, you wrote that we should bring not the police. Surely Scotland Yard, whatever its limitations, possesses the resources to guard a diplomatic personage." She moved to the window, drawing aside the thin curtain to gaze down into the court below. "The police can protect a street, Mr. Holmes. They can patrol a corridor, guard a door, watch a public entrance, but they cannot watch a drawing-room where a friend may be the knife. They cannot detect the poison in the wine poured by a trusted hand. It is in the circle round my cousin that the danger lies, in the very embassy he serves, in the diplomatic corps that surrounds him, perhaps even in the Foreign Office itself. You speak of betrayal from within. I speak of what I know, she said, turning back to face us. Our country is small, Mr. Holmes, but our passions are not. We are divided. Always divided between those who would ally with the West and those who would seek protection from the East. Between progress and tradition, between the future and the past. My cousin represents one faction, his enemies represent another. And Mr. Cyril Markham. She hesitated, her fingers plucking at the fabric of her dress. Yes, Holmes prompted. What of Mr. Markham? Mr. Markham is eager. Too eager, perhaps. He has debts, I know. Gambling debts, I believe, though he thinks himself discreet. I have seen him speak with a man I know by another name at home, a man who serves interests that are not England's and not my cousin's. And this morning, before I knew that Nicola had vanished, I watched from this very window. A cab with green wheels took the side entrance of the Metropole. I know those wheels, Mr. Holmes. They belong to Hargreaves of Kennington, a funeral company. What business has a hearse at a diplomatic hotel? What indeed, murmured Holmes. You are admirably observant, Miss Varady. Tell me, what is Pollux Stairs to you? Her eyes widened with unmistakable alarm. Pollux Stairs? You have found that name. But how? In the blotting pad at the Metropole, said Holmes quietly. An impression left by someone who wrote in haste upon paper laid over the pad. Do you know the place? She pressed her hands together, and I saw that they trembled slightly. It is a river stair in Bermondsey, one of the old landing places where boats take on cargo and passengers who wish to avoid the public wharves. 2 nights ago, a message was arranged, at least so I was told by a friend who moves in the same circles as my cousin. The 7 Club is not truly a club, you understand. It is the name given by our young patriots or conspirators, depending upon one's view, to a little warehouse in Rotherhithe where meetings are held. Secret meetings, for we have learned in our country that walls have ears, and even friends may prove to be enemies. I attended one such gathering, wearing my veil, and heard whispers of a river appointment. But I did not know when, or for what purpose. And the Carnation? Holmes inquired. How did you know to send it to me? My cousin told me that if danger came, and if I could not trust the police, I should seek the detective who had saved the Irene Adler papers, though he said you had not saved them so much as acknowledged defeat gracefully. She allowed herself a small smile. He said you were a man who understood that truth is sometimes more important than law. The Carnation is our family symbol, Mr. Holmes. It grows wild in the mountains of our homeland, and we wear it on our National Day. I hoped you would understand it as a token of good faith. Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of concentration I knew so well. Trust this much, Miss Varady, he said at length. Keep your room. Admit no one whom you do not know. If a man with a narrow skull and a scar across his wrist comes calling, a man who speaks with the accent of Bermondsey, but who handles himself like a soldier, do not open to him. He drives a funeral cab by day and conducts a different business by night, and I suspect that business touches very nearly upon your cousin's fate. We shall attend the river appointment for you, and if all goes well, you shall see your cousin again before this day is out. He paused at the door, his hand upon the latch. One question more, if you will indulge me. Your cousin, was he ever without his portfolio? Never, she said emphatically. He kept it upon his person, even while he slept, chained to his wrist when he travelled. Only this morning. She stopped, her face growing troubled. Only this morning, according to what I have learned from a chambermaid at the Metropole, whom I persuaded to speak with me. He yielded it to Mr. Markham for a moment. Mr. Markham said the Foreign Office would require certain passages to be copied before the signing, and my cousin, who trusted his secretary, allowed him to take the portfolio to the writing desk for that purpose. Holmes and I exchanged a look that required no words. "Just so," he murmured. "Watson, time presses upon us like a creditor, and we have not yet settled our accounts. We must make haste if we are to be upon the river by 9 o'clock. There are preparations to be made, and disguises to be assumed, for I think that Mr. Sherlock Holmes would be rather too conspicuous a figure at Pollux Stairs after dark." As we descended the narrow staircase and emerged once more into the fog-wrapped court, Holmes drew his Inverness cape more closely about him. The afternoon had darkened further, though whether from the advancement of the hours or the thickening of the fog, I could not have said with certainty. The city seemed to be withdrawing into itself, pulling the grey shroud tighter with each passing moment. "You perceive the pattern, Watson?" Holmes asked as we walked. "Markham is our man," I replied. "Surely that much is clear. He had access to the portfolio, he knew the envoy's movements, and Miss Faraday has seen him in suspicious company." "All true," said Holmes, "but we must be cautious of constructing our theory before we have gathered all our facts. It is a capital mistake, Watson, one I have warned against many times. We know that Markham is involved. We do not yet know the full extent of his involvement, nor the identity of his confederates. The green wheels suggest Hargreaves's funeral cab. The blotted message suggests Pollux Stairs. The scarred wrist suggests a particular type of criminal. But how these threads weave together into a complete tapestry, that remains to be seen. We secured a hansom on the Strand, and Holmes gave the driver instructions to return us to Baker Street with all possible speed. As we rattled through the fog-bound streets, I found myself thinking of the young woman we had left behind in that bare room above the photographer's studio. There had been in her bearing something that spoke of courage held in reserve against terrible need, the quality of one who has learned to endure, because endurance is the only alternative to surrender. "Holmes," I said, breaking a silence that had lasted several blocks, "do you believe we shall recover the protocol?" "If it still exists," he replied, his eyes fixed upon some point beyond the cab's window that I could not see. "Then yes, I believe we shall. But Watson, I confess that what troubles me is not the recovery of a document, important though it may be to the Foreign Office, but rather the fate of the man who carried it. Diplomatic protocols can be rewritten, treaties can be renegotiated, but a life, once taken, admits of no amendment or revision. That is why we must move with both speed and caution. Too much haste, and we alert our quarry. Too little, and we may arrive to find that we are too late." The remainder of our journey passed in silence, each of us occupied with our own thoughts. The fog had risen while we talked, and as our hansom crawled along the embanked road that ran beside the Thames, it rolled between the buildings with a stealth that chilled the blood. There are parts of London where daylight is little more than a rumour, and the Thames in November is chief among them. It seemed to me, as I peered out at the grey nothingness that surrounded us, that the very gas lamps had drawn shawls about their shoulders and huddled together for warmth. Baker Street, when we reached it, seemed almost homelike by comparison, though even there the fog pressed against our windows like some hungry thing seeking admission. Mrs. Hudson had kept a good fire, and Holmes immediately set about his preparations with that systematic efficiency which characterized all his actions when the game was truly afoot. "We must appear," he said, pulling open the drawer where he kept his considerable collection of theatrical supplies, "as men who belong upon the riverside after dark. Not gentlemen slumming for adventure, Watson, but working men, perhaps dock labourers or watermen seeking employment. Your military bearing will serve us well if you can school yourself to slouch a bit and keep your hands in your pockets. I shall require a more elaborate transformation." For the next hour I watched with that fascination which never diminished as Holmes applied his art. The keen, hawk-like features gradually disappeared beneath layers of grease paint and shadow. His tall, spare frame was made to seem more compact through careful posture and the addition of padding beneath a worn pea-jacket. Most remarkably, his entire manner changed. The precise, almost feline grace of his movements became the heavier, more deliberate gait of a man accustomed to hauling cargo rather than deducing crime. "There," he said at last, surveying himself in the glass with a critical eye. "I am now Bill Withers, sometime waterman and casual labourer, presently unemployed and willing to assist with any enterprise that offers coin at the end of it. And you, Watson, shall be my mate, Tom Archer, lately of the merchant service, and also at liberty. Can you manage a Devonshire accent?" "I spent 2 years in Plymouth," I replied, "and picked up enough of the local colour to pass muster, I believe." "Excellent. Then we are armed. Not with revolvers, though I suggest you keep yours about you nonetheless, but with identities that will allow us to move freely among those who frequent Pollux Stairs after nightfall. Lestrade's man will be there, of course, watching from a distance. But we shall be in the thick of it, Watson, and I confess I feel that old thrill which comes only when one walks deliberately into danger with no certainty of the outcome." We dined hastily on cold beef and bread, for Holmes insisted that working men would not dine late, and then we made our way through the gathering darkness toward the river. The fog, if possible, had grown denser still, and the city took on that quality of muffled unreality which transforms even familiar streets into alien territories. Sounds came to us distorted and directionless, the cry of a woman, whether in laughter or distress we could not tell, the sudden clatter of hooves, impossibly close and then suddenly distant, the deep, mournful note of a foghorn from somewhere on the Thames. Chapter 4. Pollux Stairs. Pollux Stairs, so a grizzled waterman we encountered near Bermondsey, informed us when Holmes asked with perfect casualness where a man might find cheap passage downriver, descended like a broken tooth from a wharf of ill report. The very name of the place seemed to hang in the air with an ominous weight, as though it had been the scene of events better left unexamined. We approached from the landward side, through a warren of narrow streets where the buildings leaned toward one another like exhausted dancers. The warehouses here were of that ancient, smoke-blackened brick which speaks of commerce conducted in an earlier, rougher age. Their windows, where they still retained glass, were opaque with grime. Their doors stood slightly ajar, revealing interior darknesses that might have concealed anything from stored cargo to sleeping vagrants. The stairs themselves proved every bit as unprepossessing as their reputation suggested. They descended in a series of broad, irregular steps, green with slime, treacherous with the moisture, from a small landing at street level down to where the river lapped and muttered against the pilings. The smell that rose from below was that distinctive Thames perfume. Mud, sewage, rotting wood, and something else that might have been fish or might equally have been something far less innocent. By Holmes's pocket chronometer, which he consulted with the furtiveness of a man who does not wish to advertise possession of such a valuable item, it was precisely 8 o'clock when we took up our position. He had earlier explained his strategy. We would arrive an hour before the appointed time, allowing us to observe the terrain and note anyone who came early to prepare an ambush or surveillance. "Remain by this post, Watson," Holmes breathed, indicating a wooden bollard some 10 yards from the stairhead. "If you hear 3 light taps and 1 heavy upon the stairs themselves, come at once, but carefully. Mind your footing on those steps. If you hear a whistle, 2 short blasts, then run for Lestrade's man and bring him at speed. I shall be below, among the boats." "Holmes, surely it would be wiser if we remained together." "In most circumstances, yes," he interrupted gently. "But tonight we face an adversary who expects either a single person, the envoy himself, or perhaps Miss Veradi, or else no one at all if the appointment was a trap that has already been sprung. 2 men together arriving at the water's edge would excite suspicion. 1 man alone, appearing to be a vagrant seeking shelter or a waterman looking for work, will pass unremarked. Trust me, old friend. Have I ever led you into danger without good reason?" Before I could formulate a reply, though what I might have said I do not know, he was gone, melting into the fog with that soundless ease which never ceased to astonish me. I heard his feet upon the stone stairs, a brief scuffle, as he presumably negotiated the slick surface, and then nothing. The minutes that followed possessed that peculiarly elastic quality known to men who wait in darkness and uncertainty. Time seemed simultaneously to crawl and to race, each second stretching into infinity, while the quarter hours fled past with impossible speed. I occupied myself with maintaining a posture of casual vigilance, the stance of a man waiting for something, but not wishing to advertise his purpose. The sounds of the river came to me through the fog. The knock and creak of boats against their moorings, the soft splash of water against stone, voices blurred by distance and moisture into mere impressions of human speech. Once a barge loomed out of the murk, its lantern creating a small sphere of amber light that moved past like a wandering planet before disappearing again into the grey void. The bargeman did not so much as glance in my direction. Somewhere, impossibly distant, yet certainly no more than a few streets away, a church clock struck the half-hour. 8:30. I shifted my weight, feeling the cold creeping up from the stones beneath my feet, and pulled my collar higher against the damp. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when I heard them. Footsteps approaching from the direction of the warehouses, accompanied by voices pitched low in conversation. I pressed myself back against the wall, trusting to the fog and the darkness to render me invisible, and watched as 3 figures materialized from the gloom. The first was unmistakably Cyril Markham, his neat features drawn with tension, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of a coat too fine for this neighborhood. The second was a thick-set man, with the rolling gait of one accustomed to boats. The scarred wrist that Holmes had mentioned was just visible below his cuff as he gestured while speaking. The third figure surprised me, a woman in deep mourning, her face concealed by a heavy veil, her posture suggesting either grief or fear. "Not like him to be late," Markham was saying in a voice tight with anxiety. "If he suspects—" "He suspects nothing," the thick-set man growled. His accent was that of the London docks, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested education deliberately concealed. "The message brought him, and the lady here will bring him the rest of the way. You've done your part, Mr. Markham. The rest is our concern. And my money." Markham's voice rose slightly, then dropped as the scarred man made a sharp gesture of warning. "When the matter's concluded, not before. Those were the terms, and you agreed to them." They descended the stairs, their feet making hollow sounds upon the stone that came to me clearly through the fog. I waited until I could no longer hear them, then moved swiftly to the stairhead and rapped out the signal Holmes had given me. 3 quick taps with my knuckles upon the stone, then 1 heavy blow with the heel of my palm. The response came almost immediately. A soft whistle from below, barely distinguishable from the general susurrus of the river. I began my descent, moving as quickly as I dared on the treacherous surface, one hand on the slimy wall for balance. At the waterline, the fog seemed even denser, as though it rose directly from the Thames itself. I could see almost nothing beyond a radius of a few feet. Then a hand, Holmes's, though I knew it more by touch than sight, gripped my elbow and drew me to the right, toward where a darker shadow suggested the presence of a boat. "Softly, Watson," his voice breathed directly into my ear. "We are in the parlor now, and our guests have arrived. Come, but make no sound." He guided me along what I gradually discerned to be a narrow floating dock, little more than planks lashed across oil drums, until we reached what appeared to be a lighter, one of those flat-bottomed cargo vessels that ply the Thames, carrying goods too awkward or too numerous for smaller craft. A faint glow showed through gaps in the deck planking, suggesting a cabin below. Holmes moved with the confidence of one who had already explored the territory. He led me to a position at the stern, where a tarpaulin had been loosely arranged to create a space large enough for a man to conceal himself. "Wait here," he breathed. "Do not move unless I call for you, or unless you hear violence. I must position myself where I can both see and act." Then he was gone again, and I was alone with the lap of water against wood, the creak of ropes, and the knowledge that somewhere in this fog-wrapped darkness a trap was being sprung, though upon whom, and with what outcome, remained to be seen. I heard voices then, coming from within the cabin. Markham's first, high and nervous. "I've brought her, as promised. The rest is up to you." The scarred man's growl. "Get below. We don't want witnesses to whatever follows." Then a woman's voice, low and urgent, speaking in a language I did not recognize. Something Slavic, I thought, but could not be certain. The tone, however, was unmistakable. It was the voice of one trusting to warn or persuade. A sudden commotion, a scrape of chairs, a cry of alarm, then the unmistakable sound of a blow. I tensed, my hand moving to the revolver in my pocket, but Holmes's earlier injunction held me in place. "Wait unless I call for you, or unless you hear violence." But was this not violence? Or did he mean something more sustained, more clearly deadly? The decision was taken from me by the sound of the signal. 3 sharp raps that came not from stone, but from wood, the sound carrying clearly across the water. I threw off the tarpaulin and moved toward the cabin, my revolver now drawn and cocked. The cabin door stood open, and I descended a short ladder to find myself in a scene of extraordinary drama. A lantern hung from a beam, cast jumping shadows upon the walls. A man sat with his wrists roped before him to the back of a chair, broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, with a black moustache and eyes that burned like coals. This, I somehow knew with immediate certainty, was the envoy, or someone playing that role with remarkable conviction. Across from him, knife in hand, sat the scarred man from the stairs. Between them, a small iron-bound chest lay open, and within it, empty as a beggar's plate, rested no portfolio, no documents, nothing but a few scraps of packing straw. Of Markham and the veiled woman there was no sign, though a second ladder at the far end of the cabin suggested they had descended and then departed by another route. Holmes stood in the shadows near the lantern, his disguise now abandoned, his real voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "You are late, Mr. Markham," he said, though Markham was nowhere to be seen. "We do not wait for gentlemen." The scarred man sprang up with a curse, the knife gleaming in his hand. Holmes's stick, that heavy hunting crop he sometimes carried, flicked out with the speed of a striking snake. There was a solid thunk, a grunt of pain, and the knife clattered to the deck. I leapt forward to the bound man's side, my medical training asserting itself even as my mind struggled to comprehend the scene. His pulse was strong, his breathing regular, though laboured by rage or fear. He turned his head to look at me, and in perfect English, with only the slightest accent, breathed a single word. "Varadi." "Ilona's cousin," I whispered, though even as I spoke I felt a strange doubt. Something in the man's hands, which I could now see clearly in the lantern light, suggested a life spent more with pen and paper than with the ceremonial duties of an envoy. He shook his head with an expression of grim determination, and I saw then what I should perhaps have noticed immediately. This was no diplomat, despite his bearing and his evident authority. The hands were wrong, calloused in the wrong places, stained with ink rather than polished by gloves. "The valet," I said, understanding flooding in. "You're the valet who was reported with the envoy this morning." "Search behind the bulkhead," Holmes commanded sharply, indicating a section of the cabin wall that appeared to be loose. "We have 1 rat in hand. Perhaps there are 2 more in the hole." I moved to the indicated spot and pulled at the boards, which came away with surprising ease. Behind them, crammed into a space barely large enough for concealment, I found not 1, but 2 figures. Markham, his fine clothes now dishevelled and his face a mask of terror, and the veiled woman, who even now maintained her theatrical disguise, though her posture spoke of defeat rather than mourning. At that moment, Lestrade appeared at the cabin entrance, his terrier-like features arranged in an expression of professional satisfaction. "Caught them on the dock, Mr. Holmes," he announced with relish. "Just as you predicted. Tried to make a run for it the moment they heard the commotion below. Here's your pretty secretary, slinking like a tom through the fog, and his accomplice with him." Markham's neatness had utterly deserted him. His tie was awry, his collar stained with sweat despite the evening's chill, and upon his sleeve I observed that same faint dusting which Holmes had earlier noted at the Metropole. "Magnesia!" he gasped, seizing upon the excuse with desperate eagerness. "I have neuralgia. The damp aggravates." "Rosen," said Holmes coolly, moving forward and touching the powder with one long finger before bringing it to his nose with that discriminating delicacy which characterized all his examinations. "From a violin case, or more precisely, from the shop where such things are sold. Your taste in music has drawn you into a very discordant piece, Mr. Markham. Inspector Lestrade, I believe the bracelets would be appropriate. But be gentle, for he is in debt, and therefore tender in more senses than one." While Lestrade attended to securing the prisoners, for such they clearly were, Holmes turned his attention to the bound man in the chair. "Now, sir," he said, his voice gentler than it had been with Markham, "if you will forgive our night visit, we shall alter your bonds to something more to your liking." With my assistance, we freed the man's wrists. He rose, stretched those remarkable shoulders, and in a voice which, though controlled, bore unmistakably the accent of the Danube, announced, "I am Nicolas Varadin, Envoy Extraordinary of the Principality of R." "You!" I exclaimed, unable to contain my surprise. "But the valet—" "Was my double," said Varadin, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had chafed. "We exchanged dress at Calais to baffle those who hunt me. It is an old trick, but one which has served my family for 3 generations. The man you thought the envoy, my valet, Gregor, is loyal beyond question, and bears sufficient resemblance to me that in formal dress and at a distance he might pass for his master. Tonight, however, the hounds were well fed with information. Mr. Markham," he turned to regard the secretary with an expression of profound contempt, "Mr. Markham sent me a note, delivered by a boy to my actual rooms, a set of apartments I had taken privately in Whitechapel, known only to my cousin and to him. The note said that a friend would deliver me to a safer escort, that the Foreign Office had been compromised, and that I should bring the portfolio to Pollux Stairs at 9 o'clock. His friend, as you see, had a knife instead of safe passage. The portfolio?" Holmes's eye swept the cabin, taking in the empty chest, the scattered straw, the general appearance of a space that had been searched and found wanting. Varadin's lips compressed into a grim line. "When they seized me, there were 3 of them, Mr. Holmes, not just this one scarred fellow. I saw my danger. I struck the first man who approached me and flung the iron case at the second. In the struggle, the portfolio fell from beneath my coat, where I had been carrying it. It slipped." He moved to the edge of the cabin, where a narrow gap between the deck planking and the hull allowed water to be glimpsed below. "It slipped into the river," I thought, or so they believed, for they cursed, and one of them would have jumped in after it had not the current been running so swiftly. Holmes's gaze slid to the water-dark seam, and I saw that expression come over his face which indicated some rapid calculation or deduction. "Not the river," he said softly, moving to kneel beside the gap, "but a sluice which the tide empties and then refills. Inspector, a light, if you please. Watson, your handkerchief. Your Excellency, permit me." He lay flat upon the deck, heedless of the grime and damp, and thrust the lantern Lestrade provided into the narrow space. With a hook which I had not seen him acquire, though knowing Holmes, he had probably fashioned it from some piece of ship's hardware during his earlier exploration, He fished with the delicacy and precision of a surgeon performing a critical operation. The hook caught on something. There came a sodden, resistant sound, a rustle of leather against wood. And then he rose, water streaming from his sleeves, holding aloft a red leather portfolio that dripped Thames water into the lantern's glow. "It is wet," cried Tolliver, who had arrived behind Lestrade at some point during the confrontation, and now stood in the cabin entrance with an expression of mingled relief and horror. "But the writing, the signatures, surely they are ruined." Holmes had already unlatched the portfolio and drawn forth its contents, with hands that remained remarkably steady despite the cold and damp. The documents within had been wrapped in something that shone dully in the lamplight. Oiled silk, layer upon layer of it. "Oiled silk," Holmes said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Your master had prudence as well as courage, Mr. Tolliver. The signatures are smudged but legible. I have seen far worse survive, far more. We shall carry them home in a tin of rice to draw out the moisture, and I dare say that by tomorrow afternoon they will be none the worse for their adventure. I commend to you, Inspector Lestrade, the gentleman with the scar. He will tell you, with appropriate persuasion, for whom he plies his oar, and who pays him for services that extend beyond the merely funereal." "Yes, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade with professional cheerfulness, already moving to secure his prisoner more firmly. "And Mr. Markham will play us no more tunes upon his violin of treachery." Holmes looked out beyond the cabin, where through the open door the fog could be seen, rolling across the water like some living thing. "We are not quite at the coda," he murmured, so softly that I barely heard him. "There remains one figure yet to be resolved, the identity of the person who hired Markham, who knew enough to target this particular treaty, and who has connections both in London's criminal underworld and in the diplomatic circles of continental Europe. We had found the man and recovered the paper. Yet in that moment I knew, by the gleam which came into Holmes's eyes as he surveyed the wet portfolio and the captive secretary, that the true harmony of the case had not yet been sounded. He had saved the treaty from the Thames. He had not, as yet, named the hand which had sought to sell it to England's enemies. Chapter 5. The Gathering at Baker Street. It was the afternoon of the following day when our sitting-room at Baker Street held as odd a company as ever took tea upon its hearth-rug, and in the years of my association with Sherlock Holmes I had witnessed many strange gatherings in those familiar rooms. Lestrade stood with his back to the fire, an air of tidy conquest about him, his notebook prominently displayed as though it were a trophy of war. Mr. Percy Tolliver, released from the immediate crisis that had brought him to us in such distress, rarely allowed himself to look so near a smile, though the corners of his mouth twitched upward whenever his gaze fell upon the red portfolio, now dried and resting upon Holmes's desk like some recovered relic. Ilona Varadi, unveiled and dressed in a simple travelling suit of dark blue, sat by the window, with a serenity that seemed bought at a dear price, the peace of one who has endured the worst, and found that she survived it. In the armchair opposite Holmes, that very chair which had held so many supplicants and villains over the years, sat Mr. Cyril Markham. He had been released from custody upon a short tether at Mr. Tolliver's request, the Foreign Office being anxious to understand the full extent of the conspiracy before formal charges were laid. His neat appearance had been somewhat restored, But the inner disarray was visible in every nervous gesture, every darting glance toward the door, as though he still contemplated flight. Holmes had laid upon the table between us a small array of objects arranged with that neat precision which characterized all his demonstrations. They formed a sort of museum exhibit of treachery. The 7 of clubs card from Barani's shelf, a fleck of green paint preserved under glass, a strip of linen cuff bearing the punctures of hasty needlework, a cake of violin rosin still in its paper wrapping, and a penknife whose blade bore unmistakable stains of purple ink. "My method," Holmes began, his voice taking on that light, almost conversational tone which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to devastating revelation, "is to permit the facts to play their own instruments, Mr. Markham. We have had too much orchestra already, too many voices crying their separate theories, too much noise obscuring the melody. Let us try instead a quartet, 4 instruments, 4 notes, and from them we shall construct our fugue." He took up the piece of glass containing the green paint fleck and held it to the light. "This, scraped from a cuff you obligingly trimmed in the envoy's rooms yesterday morning, is arsenical green, that distinctive and somewhat poisonous shade used only by Hargreaves of Kennington upon their funeral wheels. Old Hargreaves, as Inspector Lestrade informed us, is particular about his traditions. Now one might ask, why would a funeral cab attend a diplomatic hotel on a morning when no death had occurred and no service had been ordered? Markham stared at the fire, his jaw working as though he were chewing upon words too bitter to speak aloud. "I cannot imagine," he said at length, his voice barely above a whisper. "No?" Holmes set down the glass with deliberate care. "Yet it did attend, Mr. Markham. The porter logged it in his book, a cab from Kennington, arriving at the side entrance at 11 o'clock precisely, taking up a lady in mourning who had inquired for the rooms of the envoy extraordinary. The lady in question was not Miss Varadi, who wisely remained in her own refuge. She was, rather, one whom you had hired for the role, a certain Mrs. Childers, a theatrical lady fallen upon hard times, who was willing for £5 to play the part of a grieving relative, come to visit a dying kinsman. Your purpose was to persuade the envoy, or rather, to persuade the man you believed to be the envoy, to enter the cab without a scene, without alerting the hotel staff or the Foreign Office observers." Ilona Varadi drew in a sharp breath. "My cousin said that a woman came, veiled, weeping. Gregor thought, I should say, that she might be a countrywoman in distress. He went to the cab to speak with her privately. That was when they seized him." "Precisely so," said Holmes. "But I begin at the end rather than the beginning. Let us proceed more methodically." He touched the rosin cake. "This betrays your meeting with Mrs. Childers at Barani's shop, where you purchased rosin ostensibly for your violin, which you do play, I believe, though not well, but actually to mask another scent upon your hands. That scent was carbolic, which you used not for neuralgia, as you claimed to Dr. Watson and myself upon the lighter last night, but to cleanse your penknife after tampering with something that required both cutting and chemical purification." He held up the strip of linen. "This cuff, Mr. Markham, is our first instrument, the blade. You removed it from the envoy's coat, or rather from the valet's coat, for by then the exchange had been made, though you did not know it, under the pretext of trimming a loose thread. In reality, you were attempting to access what you had discovered through your position as secretary. That His Excellency, being of a cautious and somewhat suspicious nature, carried the protocol documents not in his portfolio, but sewn into the lining of his left cuff, wrapped in oiled silk and stitched in place with thread strong enough to hold, but fine enough to escape casual notice. A slight stir passed through the room. Tolliver leaned forward, his face gone pale. "He told us the documents were in the portfolio," he said. "We assumed, as you were meant to assume," Holmes interrupted. "His Excellency is a man who has learned, through bitter experience, that assumption is the mother of diplomatic disaster. He carried the portfolio prominently, chained it to his wrist, made a great show of its importance. Meanwhile, the actual treaty rested against his skin, protected by silk and secrecy. Your penknife, Mr. Markham, bears the evidence of your attempt to extract those documents. The purple aniline stain comes from the Foreign Office copying ink, which you employed to produce a false memorandum, a river appointment, which you then pressed upon the blotting pad to create an impression. You copied upon poor hotel paper to ensure a deep indent that would survive the removal of the original. That false appointment was your insurance. If the abduction went wrong, if questions were asked, you could point to the blotter and suggest that the envoy had been lured away by unknown parties. Very neat, Mr. Markham, or it would have been, had you not made several critical errors." Markham's colour had faded to the hue of cigar ash. His hands gripped the arms of the chair as though he might otherwise fall. "The second instrument," Holmes continued relentlessly, "is the card." He tapped the 7 of clubs with one long finger. To you, the 7 club was a convenient cloak, a ready-made conspiracy into which you could insert your own machinations. You discovered, through eavesdropping, or perhaps through indiscreet conversation at some diplomatic reception, that this symbol was used among the Principality's expatriates as a token of recognition. Having observed Miss Varadi leave such a card at Barani's, for she is indeed musical and does purchase her strings there, you instructed the violin-maker, by means of a coin and a threat, that if any gentleman should ask for the lady who loves strings and orris, he should be directed to a certain address in St. Jude's Court. There, a friend of yours, calling himself a photographer, but actually serving as a lookout, waited to observe who came seeking her. Your plan was to identify anyone who might be working to protect the envoy, to see if Miss Varadi had indeed contacted Scotland Yard or some other official agency. Very thorough, Mr. Markham. But Mr. Barani's love of music exceeded your coin. He kept the card as protection for himself, a small piece of evidence that might prove useful should matters go awry. And thus you were betrayed by the very symbol you sought to exploit. Holmes paused to refill his pipe, the homely gesture seeming almost absurdly prosaic given the gravity of the revelations. He applied a match, drew deeply, and continued through a cloud of aromatic smoke. The third instrument is the wheel, or rather, what the wheel represents. Your associate with the scarred wrist, one Thomas Gredge by name, has been most explicit in the course of a long morning at Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade's interrogation methods, while perhaps lacking in subtlety, possess a certain peasant effectiveness. Gredge has named you, Mr. Markham, and he has named another, a gentleman known in certain circles as Colonel Vasiloff, though that is certainly not his baptismal name. This colonel serves interests that are neither English nor friendly to English. policy. He is, to speak plainly, an agent of a foreign power which would benefit greatly from the failure of this particular treaty." Tolliver had gone very still. "What power?" he asked quietly. "That, I think, is a question better addressed in Whitehall than in Baker Street," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic diplomacy. "Let us say merely that there are nations which would prefer that the Principality of R not align itself with Western interests, and which possess both the resources and the ruthlessness to prevent such an alignment by any means necessary." Mr. Markham was promised, according to Gregg, the sum of £5,000 for delivering the envoy and the protocol to a vessel waiting downriver. Whether the payment would actually have materialized is, of course, doubtful. Men like Colonel Vassiloff are notoriously poor at honoring obligations to traitors. "And my money," Markham's voice suddenly broke through, high and strained. "Oh, you speak of £5,000 as though it were nothing, Mr. Holmes. Do you know what it is to be in debt? To receive threats? To watch one's reputation crumble because of a few unlucky hands at cards? I was desperate." "Many men are desperate, Mr. Markham," said Holmes, and his voice had gone cold. "Few choose to betray their country and condemn a decent man to murder as their solution. For make no mistake, had your plot succeeded, His Excellency would not have survived the night. The Thames would have received him, and the treaty would have vanished into diplomatic oblivion. 3 nations might have gone to war as a consequence, and thousands of men who never heard of the Principality of R would have died in the resulting conflict. Your desperation, sir, however genuine, is no excuse for such catastrophic treason." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the coals in the grate seemed to cease their usual hissing, as though the room itself held its breath. "The 4th instrument," Holmes said at last, his voice softer now, "is the cuff itself, or rather, what the cuff reveals about access and opportunity. Our envoy, may His Excellency forgive my frankness, did not trust even his own pocket. In the cautious fashion of his people, who have learned through centuries of invasion and betrayal that survival requires constant vigilance, he wore the treaty papers in oiled silk stitched within the lining of his left cuff. Note the punctures where the thread was re-sewn, here and here, clumsily done, for the work was performed in haste. The man who snipped this thread and attempted to re-sew it knew of that cache. Who knew? Not the valet, Gregor, who had been kept ignorant of the deception by design. Not Miss Varadi, who knew only that her cousin was in danger. Not Inspector Lestrade, nor Mr. Tolliver, nor any official of the Foreign Office. Only one man in all of London had that daily, intimate opportunity to observe how His Excellency dressed, to note the slight bulk in his cuff, to deduce the presence of something hidden. Mr. Cyril Markham, private secretary, who helped his master with his coat each morning, and who had earned, through months of faithful service, a degree of trust that made close observation possible. Markham's head had dropped forward, his chin nearly touching his chest. His shoulders shook with what might have been silent weeping, or merely the tremors of a man whose nerves had finally given way under intolerable strain. "But how," asked Tolliver, "did you deduce the presence of the documents in the cuff? Even we at the Foreign Office believed they were in the portfolio." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "By the behavior of the valet, Gregor, when we found him on the lighter. He was bound, threatened with a knife, and yet when Dr. Watson approached to check his condition, the man's first concern was not for his own safety, but for his master's identity. He spoke the name Varadi as though it were a talisman. That suggested to me that he was protecting something more than his person. Later, when His Excellency revealed that he was not the valet, but the envoy himself, I observed his hands. They were not the hands of a valet. No calluses from brushing and polishing, no chemical stains from boot blacking. But they did bear the marks of one who writes constantly and who is accustomed to formal dress. The cuffs of his shirt, when I examined them more closely, showed those telltale puncture marks of recent needlework. A man does not resew his own cuffs unless something of great value has been concealed there, or unless he fears that something of great value might be discovered there by hostile eyes. He rose and crossed to his desk, where he retrieved a small glass vial containing a bluish liquid. As for proof, you forget the experiment I conducted last night while you were in custody, Mr. Markham. I took the liberty of borrowing the cuff edge you had so obligingly trimmed, which Inspector Lestrade had preserved as evidence. I soaked it in a weak solution of guaiacum tincture and peroxide, a simple chemical test which turns brilliant blue in the presence of certain oils and resins. When I touched the solution to the fabric, it blossomed like a cornflower. You had been handling, Mr. Markham, the very oiled silk which protects our treaty, the same silk which we recovered an hour later, dripping with Thames water, from the lighter at Pollux Stairs. Your hands betrayed you, sir, as surely as if you had signed a confession in your own blood. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Markham raised his head. His face was a mask of defeat, all the smoothness and charm of the diplomatic secretary stripped away to reveal something raw and broken underneath. I never meant, he began, then stopped. That is, I thought... Another pause, longer this time. I am not a wicked man, Mr. Holmes. I am simply a weak one. And weakness in this world is indistinguishable from wickedness in its consequences. That, said Holmes, not unkindly, is perhaps the only true thing you have said in the past 24 hours. Inspector Lestrade, your prisoner is ready for formal charging, I believe. As Lestrade moved forward with his handcuffs, Ilona Varadi rose from her chair. She crossed the room until she stood directly before Markham, and for a long moment she simply looked at him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the room. Our country is small, Mr. Markham. We have no great armies, no powerful alliances to protect us. We have only our courage, our cleverness, and our hope that the great powers will see us as something more than pawns upon their chessboard. My cousin came to London bearing that hope in a leather portfolio, and in his own body. You would have drowned both for money. I do not hate you. Hatred would require that I think you important enough to despise. Instead, I pity you. For you have sold not just a treaty, but your own soul. And I think you will find that the market price for souls is always less than men expect. She turned away from him then, and the dismissal in that gesture was more complete than any words could have been. Markham was led away by Lestrade, his shoulders hunched as though under a physical burden, and the door closed behind them with a finality that seemed to mark the end of more than just his presence in our rooms. Tolliver drew a long breath, which might have been a prayer of thanksgiving, or simply the exhalation of too long-held tension. Mr. Holmes, he said, the gratitude of Her Majesty's government is best expressed, Holmes interrupted with a slight smile, by the purchase of the tiniest tin of dry rice you can procure, and perhaps by a certain discretion regarding which names appear in the official report. We need not detail every thread of this conspiracy, I think. Some truths serve their purpose better when they remain in shadow. You are thinking of Colonel Vasilov? Among others. The man is known to us, Mr. Tolliver. He serves a particular master, and that master serves a particular policy. There may come a time when it is useful to have him believe that we do not know quite as much as we do. Let him think that Markham was caught by chance, that the recovery of the treaty was mere luck. Vanity will lead him to try again, and next time we shall be better prepared. Tolliver nodded slowly. I understand. There will be a quiet trial, I think. Markham will spend many years contemplating his weakness in one of Her Majesty's less comfortable establishments. As for the treaty, he gestured to the portfolio. His Excellency will sign this afternoon, once we have prepared fresh copies. The stained originals will be preserved as evidence, but the substance of the agreement will proceed as planned. Then we have preserved both a man and a paper, as our mysterious correspondent requested. Holmes glanced at Ilona Varadi. Miss Varadi, you will wish to attend the signing, I imagine. I will, she said, and then I will return home. London is impressive, Mr. Holmes, but I find I miss our mountains and our simple ways. This city is too full of fog. It obscures not just the buildings, but the souls of men, and one cannot always tell friend from enemy until it is too late. A wise observation, Holmes replied, though I would suggest that the fog you describe is not unique to London. It exists wherever men pursue power and profit without regard for conscience. Your mountains may be clearer, but I suspect the fog finds its way there as well. She smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since our meeting in St. Jude's Court. Perhaps, but at least in the mountains, one can sometimes climb above the fog and see clearly for a few moments. That is something. After Tolliver and Miss Varadi had departed, the former to his offices in Whitehall, the latter to the Metropole to reunite with her cousin, Holmes and I were left alone by the fire in that quiet which, after the clatter and drama of the past day and night, seemed in itself a sort of confession. Holmes stretched the rescued portfolio towards the grate, turning it slowly so that any remaining moisture might evaporate evenly. The leather had taken on a mottled appearance from its immersion, but the essential integrity of the thing remained. It would serve its purpose. Your deduction at the stairs, I said after a time, breaking the companionable silence, about the sluice rather than the open river. How did you arrive at that conclusion? I confess I should have thought the portfolio irretrievably lost. Holmes set the portfolio aside and filled his pipe once more, that gesture which always accompanied his transitions from action to reflection. By the smell, Watson. River water is a generalist. It bears the scent of many things, all mixed together in that distinctive Thames perfume we know so well. But a sluice, particularly one that empties and fills with the tide, bears a memory of more specific things. Ditch water, weed from a particular bank, mud from a particular depth. This leather, when I examined it closely in that first moment after we boarded the lighter, remembered something more specific than the general Thames. It spoke to me of trapped water, of a space that floods and drains rather than flowing continuously. From there, it was a simple matter of examining the boat's structure until I found the gap where such a sluice might exist." He paused, drawing on his pipe, his grey eyes distant with thought. "My dear Watson, you will put it more nobly in your account, I have no doubt. You will speak of deduction and logical inference, of the scientific method applied to criminal investigation. But in truth, it was only a matter of listening to what the mud had to say. Everything speaks, Watson, if one knows the language. Mud speaks of where it has been. Blood speaks of how it was shed. Tobacco ash speaks of who smoked it. The universe is a vast conversation, and most men go deaf through inattention. I considered this for a moment, watching the firelight play across his lean features. "And the Carnation? Did it speak to you as well?" "The Carnation spoke volumes," he replied with a slight smile. "It told me that our correspondent was educated. She knew that I would recognize a symbol from the Principality's national celebrations. It told me that she had access to a florist of quality, for the preservations was expertly done. It told me that she was desperate but not reckless, for she took the time to arrange for the flower to reach me through official channels rather than appearing at our door herself. And it told me, perhaps most importantly, that she believed in the power of symbols, that a simple white flower could convey trust, nationality, and urgency more effectively than a page of written explanation. You might have ignored it, I observed. You might have dismissed the whole affair as beyond your scope, a matter for the Foreign Office and Scotland Yard. I might have, he agreed. But Watson, you know me well enough by now to understand that I cannot resist a puzzle, particularly one presented with such elegance. And besides, he gestured with his pipe toward the window, where the fog still pressed against the glass. There was something in that letter, in the choice of words. If England wishes to save both a man and a paper, note the phrasing, Watson. Not if you wish, but if England wishes. Our correspondent was appealing not to my vanity or to my professional pride, but to something larger. She was suggesting that the case transcended mere personal interest, that it touched upon matters of national consequence. How could I refuse such an appeal? And did it? Transcend personal interest, I mean. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. "That is the question, is it not?" he said at last. "We have saved a treaty, prevented a murder, and brought a traitor to justice. Mr. Tolliver assures us that the diplomatic consequences will be positive, that 3 nations will sleep easier in their beds tonight. But will they, Watson? Or have we simply postponed an inevitable conflict, bought a few months or years before the next crisis erupts? I confess I do not know. I am a detective, not a statesman. I deal in evidence and deduction, not in the murky waters of international politics. Yet you chose to involve yourself. I did, because, in the end, I believe that truth matters more than politics, that justice, however imperfect, is preferable to chaos, and that a man's life is worth saving even if the treaty he carries is merely a temporary expedient in the endless chess game of nations. He turned to look at me directly. You think me cynical, Watson. Perhaps I am. But I am not so cynical that I cannot recognize decency when I encounter it. Miss Varadi's courage, the envoy's prudence, even young Markham's belated recognition of his own weakness, these are not nothing. They are the small lights that persist in the fog, and it is by such lights that we must navigate. I found myself moved by this uncharacteristic speech. Holmes was not given to philosophy, preferring the concrete to the abstract, the demonstrable to the theoretical. But in that moment, with the fog pressing against our windows and the rescued treaty drying by our fire, he seemed almost willing to acknowledge that his work, our work, carried a significance that extended beyond the mere solution of puzzles. "You will write it up, I suppose?" he asked, his tone lightening. "Another of your sensational narratives, full of atmospheric description and dramatic reveals?" "I will," I confirmed, "though I shall try to be faithful to the facts, Holmes, whatever you may think of my literary embellishments." "The facts," he mused. "Yes, do be faithful to those, Watson. They are sufficiently remarkable without ornament. A treaty sewn into a cuff, a carnation as a calling card, a portfolio rescued from a tidal sluice. These things speak for themselves. Though I have no doubt you will find room for fog and gaslight, and all the other properties of your theatrical imagination." "The fog was real enough," I protested, "as were the gaslight and the danger." "Indeed they were," he agreed, "and that is precisely why they need no enhancement. But write as you will, old friend. If my methods become known through your narratives, then perhaps some good will come of it. Perhaps some young person will read of deduction and observation and chemical analysis, and will choose a life of rational inquiry rather than one of superstition and ignorance. That would be legacy enough, I think." Thus ended the affair of the Vanished Envoy, an affair which, had it taken another turn upon that treacherous tide, might have altered maps and minted medals for men who did not deserve them. For myself, I found in it once more the salutary lesson that in London, as in the deserts I had once known as a military surgeon, the difference between safety and ruin is often no more than the breadth of a thread, or in this case, the thickness of oiled silk and the quickness of a detective's reasoning. The treaty was signed that afternoon in a quiet ceremony at the Foreign Office. Holmes declined to attend, saying that he preferred to let the diplomats claim their moment of triumph without the distraction of the detective who had made it possible. His Excellency Nicola Varadin did, however, call upon us the following morning, bringing with him a small case containing a set of medals struck by his government to honor those who had preserved the treaty. Holmes accepted his with good grace, but immediately placed it in a drawer of his desk, where it joined a curious collection of other honors: a ring from the King of Bohemia, a snuff-box from the King of Scandinavia, and various other tokens from grateful clients whose names he would never reveal. Gewgaws, he called them, but I noticed that he kept them carefully, as though they represented something more than mere vanity, perhaps a record of cases solved, of lives saved, of small victories won against the forces of chaos and criminality that perpetually threatened to overwhelm civilization. As for Cyril Markham, he was tried in camera, that is, in secret session, and sentenced to 15 years of penal servitude. The details of his treason were never made public, the Foreign Office preferring to maintain the fiction that the entire affair had been a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate conspiracy. Whether this was wise statecraft or mere institutional cowardice, I cannot say. But I noted with some satisfaction that Markham's name disappeared from the diplomatic lists and that certain reforms were instituted in the hiring and supervision of private secretaries attached to foreign envoys. The fog, which had been our constant companion throughout this adventure, finally lifted 3 days after the treaty's signing. London emerged from its grey shroud like a patient recovering from illness, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. The sun, that rare visitor to our November streets, made a brief appearance, and for a few hours the city seemed almost cheerful. Holmes and I stood at our window, watching the transformation. "The fog will return," he observed. "It always does. But for now we can see clearly, and that is something." "Like Miss Varadi's mountains," I suggested. "Like her mountains," he agreed. "Though I confess I prefer the fog, Watson. It makes the moments of clarity more precious, and it provides excellent cover for those who must sometimes move through the world unseen." I did not ask him to elaborate on this cryptic remark. After so many years of friendship and collaboration, I had learned that Holmes kept his own counsel about certain matters, and that some questions were better left unasked. But I understood, I think, what he meant. That his work required him to inhabit a world of shadows and uncertainties, where clarity was rare and dangerous knowledge was the currency of survival. The case of the Vanished Envoy had given us both a treaty preserved, a life saved, a traitor exposed. But it had also reminded us that the fog never truly lifts, that danger is always present beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties and official reassurances, and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance. As I sat down to write this account, with Holmes already absorbed in some new problem involving the chemical analysis of various types of clay, I found myself thinking of Ilona Varadi and her white carnation. It had been such a simple gesture. A pressed flower slipped into an envelope with a brief note, and yet it had set in motion a chain of events that had saved a treaty and possibly prevented a war. How many other such gestures, I wondered, go unnoticed? How many small acts of courage and cleverness occur every day in London and around the world, unrecorded and uncelebrated? Holmes solves the cases that come to him. But how many mysteries remain forever unsolved? How many crimes go unpunished? How many tragedies unfold in silence? These are philosophical questions, perhaps, and not the proper concern of a chronicler who aims merely to set down the facts of a case. But they occurred to me nonetheless as I wrote, and I set them down here not because they have answers, but because they seem to me to be worth asking. The fog has returned to Baker Street as I write these final lines. It presses against our windows once more, as though it had never left, as though those few days of clarity were merely a dream. Holmes is at his chemical bench, peering through his microscope at some sample that has captured his interest. Mrs. Hudson is making her rounds with tea and biscuits. The fire crackles in the grate. All is as it was, and yet nothing is quite the same. Somewhere in London, a treaty is being ratified. Somewhere, a young woman is preparing for her journey home to the mountains. Somewhere, a man sits in a prison cell, contemplating the consequences of his weakness. And here in Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes and I continue our work, listening to what the mud has to say, reading the language of tobacco ash and footprints and bloodstains, piecing together the truths that others overlook. It is not glamorous work, despite what my narratives might suggest. It is difficult, often frustrating, occasionally dangerous, and rarely appreciated by those who benefit from it. But it is necessary work. And as long as the fog continues to roll through London's streets, obscuring truth and sheltering villainy, there will be need for men like Holmes, men who can see clearly even in the darkest murk, who can follow a thread through the most tangled maze, and who understand that the smallest details often contain the greatest truths. The case of the vanished envoy is closed, but the fog endures, and somewhere in its depths another mystery is already taking shape.